I was kneeling on the cold stone floor of that abandoned church, holding a shard of burned ceramic in my hands when it moved. I swear on everything holy, the small statue of the Virgin Mary I'd helped burn 3 months prior moved before my eyes. A black tear rolled down the statue's cracked face, and a voice whispered in the absolute silence, "Why did you burn me, son?" In that moment, my world collapsed and rebuilt itself simultaneously. It was October 2019. I was 22, and I thought I knew everything about faith, rebellion, and freedom. How wrong I was. My name is Gabriel, and for 3 years of my life, I lived in the shadows of a sect that promised the liberation of the soul through the denial of everything I had learned about God. It wasn't exactly a satanic cult, as many imagine when they hear these stories. It was more subtle, more intellectual. We called it the Circle of Salome, a group that met in members' homes to study esoteric texts, practice rituals of spiritual purification, and primarily burn symbols of what they called oppressive faith. I entered this world at 19, when I was in philosophy college and felt lost, revolted by everything and everyone. The truth is, I've always been a questioner. Since I was little, I bothered my mother with questions about God, about suffering, about why good people go through bad things. My family was devout Catholic, the kind that goes to Mass every Sunday, prays the Rosary before bed, and hangs saints in every room of the house. My mother, Mary, was the kind of woman who found hope in any situation through prayer. My father, John, a simple man who worked in a mechanic's shop, had a quieter but equally strong faith. He didn't talk much about religion, but I sometimes saw him standing before the statue of Saint Joseph in the living room, head bowed, moving his lips in silent prayer. Hier kraut. Was this date? Was my twait? When I went to college, all those certainties began to crumble. Philosophy professors presented arguments against the existence of God that I had never considered. Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault. Each author I read seemed to confirm that religion was indeed the opiate of the masses, a way to control the masses through fear and the promise of future rewards. I felt intellectually superior to my parents, as if I had finally woken up from a childish dream. The arrogance of youth is a terrible thing, and I was completely consumed by it. It was on one of those nights of existential questioning that I met Helen. She was a few years older, a graduate student in anthropology, and she had a way of talking about spirituality that was both seductive and disturbing. Helen didn't completely deny the existence of the sacred. She simply suggested that we had been taught to look in the wrong direction. True spiritual power, she said, comes from embracing our integral nature, including what society teaches us to repress. She talked about polarities, about how light only exists in contrast to darkness, about how ancient mystery cults had a deeper understanding of human nature than modern Christianity. At first, they were just conversations in cafes near the university. Helen lent me books on Gnosticism, Hermeticism, ceremonial magic. I felt like someone who had discovered secret knowledge, hidden truths that only a privileged few could understand. With each text I read, the further I drifted from the simple faith of my parents. When they asked why I no longer went to Mass, I responded disdainfully that I had evolved beyond those primitive superstitions. It was Helen who invited me to the Circle's first meeting. It took place in an old house in the city center, a 1940s building with heavy furniture and dark curtains. When I arrived, about 15 people were sitting in a circle in the main room. Alternating black and white candles created dramatic lighting, and the air was thick with the smell of sage and cedar incense. In the center of the circle, on a red cloth, were several objects: crystals, a ceremonial dagger, some ancient books, and a small statue that I immediately recognized. In the following weeks, I tried to convince myself that what had happened was perfectly normal. After all, I was going through a profound spiritual transformation. It was natural for my psyche to react intensely to the symbols of my old faith. I continued attending the Circle's meetings, participating in the rituals, studying the recommended texts. Gradually, I became even more estranged from my family and friends who did not share this new world view. My parents noticed the change almost immediately. My mother tried to make small talk about college, about my classes, but I responded with monosyllables or diverted the conversation to criticisms of the intellectual backwardness of traditional religion. My father, sensing the tension, tried to keep the peace by avoiding anything that could generate conflict. But I saw the sadness in his eyes when I refused to accompany the family to Sunday Mass, or when I made sarcastic comments about his prayers before meals. The worst moment was when my mother discovered some of the books I was reading. She had entered my room to make the bed and saw on my desk a copy of the Satanic Bible, along with notes I had made on invocation rituals. The expression on her face was pure horror, as if she had discovered that her son had become a dangerous stranger. She left the room without saying a word, but I heard her crying in the bathroom afterward. That night, my father knocked on my bedroom door. When he entered, he held in his hands the rosary that my grandmother had given him on her deathbed. "Son," he said in a choked voice, "I don't understand what's happening to you, but I know your grandmother is suffering in heaven, seeing the grandson she loved so much losing himself like this." I tried to argue, to explain that I wasn't losing myself, but finding myself discovering truths that they were incapable of understanding. But the words came out bitter, full of an arrogance that disgusted me even at the moment I uttered them. If you're enjoying this story and want to continue following accounts like this, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here is very important to me, and I'm sure you'll identify with other testimonies I share here. The months that followed saw an escalating involvement with the circle and estrangement from my family. Helena had become my girlfriend, and together we delved deeper and deeper into that world of rituals, esoteric studies, and systematic rejection of everything that represented traditional Christian faith. I felt powerful, enlightened, as if I had access to knowledge that most people would never understand. But something was growing inside me, a restlessness that I couldn't explain or make disappear. It was the dreams that began to disturb me first. Every night, I saw the same image, the small statue of Our Lady, moving among the flames, looking at me with that expression of infinite sadness. Sometimes, in the dream, she extended her hand towards me, as if asking for help. Other times, she simply repeated the question I had heard at the first ceremony: "Why do you burn me, son?" I would wake up sweating, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that they were merely manifestations of my subconscious adapting to the spiritual changes I was undergoing. But the dreams grew more intense over time. I started seeing not only the statue, but also my grandmother, who had died when I was 15. In the dream, she was kneeling before a makeshift altar, weeping over the burned pieces of the Our Lady statue. When she saw me, she reached out her hands in supplication. "Grandson, what have they done to you? What have they done to my boy?" These nightly visions began to affect my sleep, my concentration in college, even my relationship with Helen. It was during one of the circle's most intense ceremonies that everything came to a head. It was a new moon night in September, and Sister Lucifer had planned a ritual she called the final consecration. According to her, those who went through this ceremony would be definitively freed from any remaining traces of previous religious conditioning. The ritual involved not only burning sacred images, but also pronouncing explicit vows of renunciation of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by the flames of several candles, and holding a wooden crucifix that was supposed to burn. While I recited the vows of renunciation, the words were on the tip of my tongue. I had memorized every phrase in the weeks before, but when I opened my mouth to speak, something strange happened. Instead of the ritual's words, what came out was a prayer I hadn't said in years. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the circle looked at me with expressions ranging from surprise and disappointment to something that looked like fear. Helen's eyes were wide, as if she were seeing a stranger. Sister Lucifer slowly approached me, her face contorted in an expression of contained anger. "Gabriel," she said in a low, threatening voice, You can't be serious. After everything you've learned, after all the evolution you've gone through, you're going to regress to these childish superstitions. I tried to explain that I didn't know where that prayer had come from, that it must have been just a conditioned reflex from my childhood, but even as I spoke, I felt I was lying to myself. Something inside me had refused to pronounce those vows of renunciation, some part of my soul that remained untouched by all the months of esoteric indoctrination. The ceremony ended in a tense atmosphere, and I realized from the looks I received that my position in the group had changed drastically. In the following weeks, I was gradually excluded from the circle's most important activities. Helen began to treat me coldly, as if I were a failed project. Sister Lucifer looked at me with suspicion, always making subtle comments about people who didn't have the courage to fully embrace their spiritual freedom. I felt isolated, rejected by the group that had become my new family, but at the same time unable to return to the faith I had abandoned with such disdain. It was in this state of confusion and loneliness that I decided to return to the temple where it all began. It was a Thursday night, 3 months after the first ceremony I had witnessed. The house was empty, abandoned for weeks since the owners had moved to another city. I managed to enter through the back door, which was unlocked, and walked to the room where the meetings took place. The atmosphere was completely different. Without the candles, without the incense, without the people, it just seemed like a common room in an old house. But in the center, exactly where the makeshift altar used to be, there was something that made my heart stop. Fragments of the statue we had burned months before. Pieces of blackened ceramic, some still with traces of the blue paint of the robe, scattered on the floor like the remnants of a crime. I knelt in the midst of those ruins, and for the first time in years, allowed the tears to come. They weren't tears of conscious repentance, not yet. They were tears of exhaustion, of confusion, of a loneliness so deep it felt like a black hole in the center of my chest. I picked up the largest of the fragments, a piece that still showed part of the image's face, and held it in my trembling hands. That's when the miracle that changed my life forever happened. The fragment of ceramic in my hands began to emanate a gentle warmth, as if it were being heated by an inner light source. And then, impossible but undeniable, a tear welled up from where the statue's eye had been, a crystalline, pure tear that reflected the few lights entering the windows of the empty house. The voice I heard this time wasn't a distant whisper. It was clear, maternal, filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to be unconditionally loved. "Why do you burn me, son?" the voice asked. But even burned, I remained here waiting for you to come home. At that moment, everything collapsed inside me. All the months of intellectual arrogance, of adolescent rebellion disguised as spiritual evolution, of systematic rejection of everything that represented the simple and direct love of my parents. I saw myself for what I really was, a lost, frightened young man who had traded the certainty of family love for the illusion of power that came from feeling special, chosen, different from others. I cried as I hadn't cried since childhood, with sobs that came from somewhere very deep within my soul, and as I cried, I felt as if years of tension, anger, and wounded pride were being drained from my body. The ceramic fragment in my hands remained warm, and I could swear I felt a pulse in it, as if it were a tiny heart beating in sync with mine. "Forgive me," was all I could manage to say, repeating it like a mantra. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." I didn't know if I was asking forgiveness from the Virgin Mary, God, my parents, or myself. Perhaps it was all of them at once. I only knew that the word was the only one that made sense at that moment, the only one that could express what I was feeling. When I finally managed to get up, more than an hour had passed. I carefully tucked the fragment into my pocket and left the house with a certainty I hadn't felt in a long time. It was time to go home. Home, for real, not the places where I had tried to build a new identity, but the home where two simple, loving people had spent over 20 years trying to teach me that love doesn't need to be complicated to be true. The walk to my parents' house was one of the longest of my life. With every block, my mind invented excuses to postpone the meeting. They'll reject me after everything I've done, I thought. How can I show up there after having disregarded everything they believe in? But the warm fragment in my pocket constantly reminded me that true love doesn't work by the rules of human pride. True love waits. True love forgives. True love never gives up. When I finally reached the front door, it was almost 2 in the morning. The living room light was on, which meant my parents were still awake, probably watching some TV show or just chatting about their day, as they had done every night for over 25 years of marriage. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. My father answered, and the expression on his face when he saw me is something I will carry with me forever. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was pure relief, as if he had spent months holding his breath and could finally breathe again. "Mary," he shouted into the house, "Gabriel's back." And then, without saying anything else, he hugged me with a force that almost knocked me over. My mother appeared seconds later, still in her robe, her hair disheveled, and her eyes red as if she had been crying recently. When she saw me standing there at the door, being hugged by my father, she clasped her hands to her chest and whispered, "Thank God, thank God, thank God." It was only then that I realized that during all those months, I was finding myself away from home. They had spent sleepless nights worrying about me, praying for me, hoping I would come back. The three of us sat in the living room, on the same couch where I had heard hundreds of biblical stories as a child, where I had learned my first prayers, where I had received thousands of hugs and words of affection over the years. At first we were silent, just enjoying the fact that we were together again. Then, gradually, I began to tell them everything that had happened. I didn't omit anything. I talked about the circle, about Helen, about the rituals, about the burned statue, and about the miracle I had witnessed that night. My parents listened without interruption, without judgment, without expressions of shock or disapproval. When I finished speaking, my mother got up and went to the bedroom. She returned a few minutes later, carrying something in her hands, a small statue of Our Lady of Aparecida, identical to the one I had seen burned in the circle. "This one," she said with an emotional voice, "was on your grandmother's bedside table when she died. In the last few months, every night before bed, I prayed to her to intercede for you, to bring my son back home." I took the burned fragment out of my pocket and placed it next to the intact statue. The contrast was striking. On one side, the charred remains of something that had been destroyed by my rebellion. On the other, the same image preserved by the love and unwavering faith of my parents. But there was something more, an invisible connection between the two pieces, as if the burned image and the preserved image were part of the same story, different chapters of the same journey of love and forgiveness. "Son," my father said that morning, "we never stopped believing you would come back. It may have taken a while, it may have been difficult, but we knew that the love we planted in you all these years couldn't just disappear. True love is stronger than any confusion, any rebellion, any wrong path we may take." In the weeks that followed, I slowly began the process of rebuilding my life and my faith. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of pride to swallow, many bridges to rebuild, many mental and emotional habits to change. I definitively broke with Helen and the circle, which brought a strange sense of grief, as if I were losing a part of myself. But gradually, I realized that what I was losing was precisely the part that wasn't really mine: the arrogance, the need to feel superior to others, the illusion that true spirituality had to be complicated and exclusive. I started attending Mass with my parents again, initially more out of gratitude than genuine conviction. But week after week, month after month, I rediscovered the beauty of simple faith, of community, of the tradition that connects generations across the centuries. It wasn't a blind or uncritical faith. It was a faith matured by suffering, seasoned by experience, strengthened by the understanding that God's love does not depend on our ability to understand it completely. The fragment of the burned statue became a powerful symbol for me. I kept it in a small wooden box by my bedside, along with the rosary my father had given me that night. Every morning, upon waking, I would look at those two objects and remember two fundamental truths. First, that human pride is capable of destroying even the most sacred things. Second, that God's love is greater than any destruction we can cause. Today, 5 years after that transformative October, I am a completely different person. I finished my philosophy degree, but with a completely new perspective on what it means to seek truth. I married a wonderful woman I met in our parish community, someone who understands that true faith is not incompatible with intellectual questioning, but offers the solid foundation upon which we can build a life of meaning and purpose. My parents, now grandparents to our first child, often tell me how they prayed during those difficult months. My mother admits there were times when she doubted if I would ever really come back, times when the pain of seeing her son drifting away seemed greater than her faith in the intercession of Our Lady. But she never stopped praying, never stopped lighting candles, never stopped believing that the love planted over so many years would sprout back to the surface. The fragment of the burned statue remains on my nightstand, now next to a new image of Our Lady that my wife gave me as a wedding gift. Sometimes, especially during times of difficulty or doubt, I take that piece of ceramic in my hands and remember that we all carry wounds, we all go through times of destruction and reconstruction, we all need grace to become whole again. The most profound lesson I learned from this whole experience is that true love is neither possessive nor controlling. My parents could have tried to prevent me from exploring other ideas, they could have cut me off financially, they could have used guilt and manipulation to keep me close, but they chose the harder and more powerful path, the path of trust. They trusted that the love they had planted in me was stronger than any external influence, trusted that the truth would eventually prevail over confusion, trusted that prayer and example are worth more than 1,000 arguments. Looking back at that arrogant 19-year-old, who thought he had discovered truths that his parents would never understand, I feel a mixture of compassion and gratitude. Compassion, because I recognize in him the genuine pain of someone who was trying to find his place in the world, who was grappling with profound and real existential questions. Gratitude because that whole journey, however painful it may have been, led me to an understanding of faith that is far more solid and mature than would have been possible without going through the ordeal. The statue that moved amidst the flames remains a mystery to me. I don't know if it was a miracle in the traditional sense of the word, a direct supernatural manifestation, or if it was my own consciousness projecting onto an external image the inner voice that had never stopped calling me back home. Honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that in that moment of greatest confusion and loneliness, I received exactly what I needed, a reminder that I was unconditionally loved, that I was never truly alone, that there was always a way back. Today, when I talk to young people who are going through faith crises similar to mine, I always say the same thing: questioning is natural and healthy, exploring different ideas is part of growth, but never underestimate the value of the simple wisdom passed down by people who truly love us. The faith of our parents and grandparents may seem naive in the light of modern intellectual complexities, but it is built on something that no philosophy can replace: the lived experience of unconditional love. A few weeks ago, my 3-year-old daughter found the fragment of the burned statue on my nightstand. She picked it up with her curious little hands and asked, "Daddy, why is this Our Lady broken?" I explained to her, in simple language, that sometimes people hurt sacred things when they are confused and sad, but that Our Lady's love is so great that she forgives and continues to take care of us, even when we hurt her. My daughter was thoughtful for a moment, then kissed the fragment of ceramic and said, "There, now she's not sad anymore." In that simple moment, A 3-year-old taught me something that years of philosophical study had not, that healing comes from love, not intellectual understanding, that forgiveness is an act of the heart, not the mind, that true faith has the simplicity of essential things. My wife, who knows my whole story, sometimes asks me if I'm not afraid that our daughter will go through the same process of radical questioning that I did. The answer is no, I'm not afraid. In fact, I hope she questions, that she explores, that she doesn't accept anything just because her parents said so. But I also hope that, when the time comes to choose between true love and the seductive illusions of intellectual pride, she will remember the example we try to set, the stability we try to provide, the faith lived day to day, that is far more eloquent than any theological argument. The burned fragment now shares space in our home with other family mementos, photos of grandparents, objects that belong to great-grandparents, small treasures that carry stories of love and faith passed down through generations. Each object tells a part of our story, but the fragment holds a special place because it represents not only what we received, but also what we almost lost and managed to recover. Sometimes, when I'm going through tough times at work or in my personal life, I pick up that piece of pottery and remember that I've been through much worse. I remember the lost young man I was, surrounded by people who promised liberation, but offered only a more sophisticated prison. I remember the profound loneliness of someone who distances themselves from everything true in search of something that seems more interesting or modern. The truth is, there's no shortcut to wisdom. There's no secret knowledge that makes us superior to other human beings. There's no special group, esoteric circle, or alternative doctrine that gives us privileged access to the fundamental truths of existence. What there is the slow and sometimes painful journey of growth, of learning through experience, of humility, in the face of mysteries we cannot fully comprehend. My parents, now in their 60s, continue to be living examples for me of how to live an authentic faith. They're not perfect people, they never pretended to be. They have their limitations, their fears, their occasional doubts, but they have something that all the alternative philosophies I explored failed to offer me: consistency. Agreement after agreement, Sunday after Sunday, prayer after prayer. They built a life based on solid principles that stand the test of time. When my son is born in a few months, I intend to tell him the story of the burned fragment, not as a way to scare him or discourage him from thinking for himself, but as a reminder that true love is always stronger than our mistakes, our rebellions, our attempts to distance ourselves from what truly matters. I intend to teach him that questioning is important, but that questioning without humility leads to arrogance, that seeking the truth is noble, but that the deepest truth is not always the most complex or the most exclusive, that growing up sometimes means discovering that our parents knew important things that took us years to understand. The miracle of the statue that moved amidst the flames remains a sacred mystery to me. I don't need to understand it completely to recognize its transformative power. I don't need to explain it scientifically to be grateful for the impact it had on my life. Some experiences are too great to be reduced to simple explanations, too sacred to be dissected by rational analysis. What I know for sure is that on that October night, on the cold floor of an abandoned house, I received a gift I didn't deserve: the chance to start over, the opportunity to choose again, this time with more wisdom and less pride. The grace of discovering that my parents' love and God's love were greater than all my mistakes combined. Today, when I look at the burned fragment next to the intact image on my nightstand, I see not only religious symbols, but tangible reminders of a journey that completely transformed me. I see proof that it's possible to get completely lost and still find your way back. I see evidence that true love waits, forgives, and embraces, even when we think we've gone too far to return. This is my story, my testimony, my gratitude transformed into words. I share it not because it's extraordinary,
but precisely because it's common. How many of us haven't gone through moments of rebellion, questioning, distancing ourselves from what our parents taught us? How many haven't explored paths that seemed more interesting or modern than the simple faith of our childhood? The difference lies not in never getting lost, but in having the humility to recognize when we are lost, and the courage to ask for help to find our way back. The difference lies in understanding that maturing doesn't necessarily mean rejecting everything we learned when we were young, but rather integrating the lessons of experience with the wisdom received. The burned fragment reminds me every day that I carry scars from this journey, marks that will never completely disappear, but it also reminds me that scars can be beautiful when they tell stories of healing, forgiveness, and love that was stronger than all attempts at destruction. If you're going through something similar to what I went through, if you're questioning your faith, if you're being drawn to promises of secret knowledge or spiritual liberation through the rejection of your roots, I only ask one thing: remember who loved you first. Remember the people who were by your side when you had nothing to offer in return, who invested in you when you were just a promise, who kept believing even when you stopped believing in you. I'm not saying not to question, not to explore, not to grow. I'm saying not to throw away true treasures in exchange for trinkets that shine brightly but don't stand the test of time. I'm saying to remember that wisdom sometimes has the appearance of simplicity, and that true love rarely needs complicated rituals or exclusive knowledge to manifest itself. The statue that moved amidst the flames didn't give me answers to all my philosophical questions. It didn't solve all the mysteries of existence that troubled me when I was 19, but it gave me something far more valuable: the certainty that I am unconditionally loved, that I am never truly alone, that there is always a way back home, and sometimes, in the end, that's all we need to know.